Hello and welcome to the Christ Baptist Church devotional as we're going through the book of Genesis and making our way slowly, but we are making our way through the book, and we've gone all the way through to chapter 37, and now we're in a very strange chapter, chapter 38. We've made our way through the life of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and now have just gotten to chapter 37 where Joseph was sold into captivity into Egypt by his brothers, who really they really hated him. They had such favoritism they saw between the different mothers and the sons, and just between that and the hatred, it shows how they acted on that hatred. But God was still fulfilling his promise. And that's the thing I want you to see here in Genesis, all the way from creation to the fall, to the flood, to the first covenant that God made with Noah, first covenant in the Bible, and all the way through from Abraham to his children, the promise he made to Abraham. God is faithful to fulfill his promise regardless of the failures of the people that he made the promise to. And so we've seen Abraham continually have his faith just falter, and his faith began to fail as he didn't trust God about the children he was going to have. And Isaac didn't want to trust God and wanted to go with Esau rather than Jacob. And Jacob as well did not trust God in all of his deception. And each had their own issues of what they were dealing with. And Jacob, and having his children, and he himself was deceived, God is still faithful, pushing him along, moving along, to make sure that his promise will be fulfilled in having all the descendants come from Abraham, from the child of the promise. And so even in great circumstances that we saw with Joseph, I mean, he was sold to the Midianites by his brothers and then sold as a slave in Egypt. It seems like there's no hope now that the brothers are going to split up. But we see that God's hand is working even in the midst of that. We're going to see that as we get again to the story of Joseph. But here there's a story that just comes out of nowhere and intervenes about Judah. And our lesson here today is going to be about how God is going to be faithful even when we show lack of spiritual discernment. We're going to see that Judah had no spiritual discernment whatsoever. He had really no care whatsoever about what was going on around him. And it cost him in humiliation, but God is still faithful. And let's see where this takes us in Genesis chapter 38. Beginning in verse 1. And it came about at that time that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. So right there we see Judah departed from his brothers. And we saw that in verse 26 of chapter 37. Judah was upset because he told his brothers, you know, what profit is it for us to kill our brother? And let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. So his brothers listened to him. So he went ahead and went completely against Reuben, who wanted to just eventually get him back to his father. But the brothers were splitting up, and Judah himself was separating from the brothers. And so he did. He departed from his brothers. He left there and went to a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. Well, then we get to verse 2, where Judah as well just forgets everything that he was told. Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he took her and went into her. Now, he would remember that Isaac and Jacob were not to take wives from the Canaanites. And so they didn't. And they knew that. They knew where they were supposed to get their wives from. But he saw a certain Canaanite lady who was... her name was Shua, and he goes into her. Now, as soon as he gets this Canaanite lady that he's going to come in with, essentially act as if she's his wife, so she conceived and bore a son and named him And she conceived again and bore a son and named him Onan. So there's two sons now from this Canaanite woman, who God said, really, through Abraham, you're not supposed to take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. And if you remember way back in Genesis chapter 7, 8, and 9, mainly 8 and 9, Canaan was cursed by Noah. He was cursed. And he will serve his brothers Japheth and Ham, and Japheth and Shem. And so here, Judah is going completely against God's plan. And what we learned there as well is the idea of Canaan and what would have come through. There's a hint here. This is where the seed of the sons of God would be coming through, because God, way back at the beginning, the Amorites, he has destined them for destruction. And destruction by the children of Israel. Destruction completely by Moses, by David, to kill all the people who came from that line. Well, Judah here has no discernment whatsoever. He takes a daughter of a Canaanite, and she has two sons, and Onan. And she bore still another son and named him Shelah. And it was at Chezib that she bore him. So she had three sons, Onan, and Shelah. Those are the three sons from the Canaanite mixing with Judah. Verse 6, now Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. We don't know where this wife came from. We don't know whether she was a Canaanite or not a Canaanite. The Bible doesn't tell us. But he took a wife for Ur. But Ur, Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord took his life. Now, those are one of those verses that just scare you. You're looking and you say, wait a minute. He was evil in the sight of the Lord, so God took his life. He was wicked, so God killed him. But what do you mean wicked? What did he do? We all want to know. What did Ur do? Doesn't tell us. Just says this was his character. So, because he died, verse 8, Judah said to Onan, that's Ur's brother, he said, go into your brother's wife and perform your duty as a brother-in-law to her and raise up offspring for your brother. So the point was, even before Moses had determined this, when he wrote the books of the law, there was a concept called a levirate marriage, or if your brother dies and his wife has no children, she then becomes your wife so that she can have children in the family, because she needs an inheritance. The whole point is passing an inheritance down and keeping it split. Otherwise, he dies, she gets nothing, and the inheritance all goes to the living brother. So go into your brother's wife, perform your duties as a brother-in-law to her. In other words, give her a child and raise up offspring for your brother so that his inheritance will stay and his name will carry on. Well, Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. Onan knew that if he has a child, it's not going to be my child. He's not going to be in my inheritance. He's going to be in Ur's inheritance. So Onan knew that he would not be his, so he went into his brother's wife. He wasted his seed on the ground in order not to give offspring to his brother. So he said, sure, I'll go into Ur's wife, and I can be a husband to her, but there's absolutely no way I'm going to give her a child intentionally. Now that was, we would say it was the custom of the land. It was what they were supposed to do, and they were taught that. And he said, absolutely not. Verse 10, but what he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, so he took his life also. Now this seems pretty harsh from God's standpoint, doesn't it? One, he just says he was wicked and he killed him. The other says because he didn't give his brother's wife a child, the Lord killed him as well. That's a pretty tough standard to meet. If that's God's standard, he's going to kill pretty much everybody. So what's going on here? Well, the best I can determine of what's going on, we take a look. One thing we know is God is moving in the background continuously. God is continually moving, and he's preserving his seed. Remember, that was what we learned in Genesis 6, 7, and 8. He's preserving a seed just like he preserved his seed on the boat. He's always preserving a seed, and we don't know where the seed is. We just know it's going through the child of promise, Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob, because the seed was promised in Genesis 3:15. But Abraham was the man that God selected, and he said, in your name, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So that's where the seed is. But we saw it coming through Isaac, but then we said, which child? Well, Jacob got the birthright. Jacob got the blessing, so it must be Jacob. But now, which of the 12? We don't know at this point. At this point. We do when we look at the rest of the Bible, but we don't at this point. And we see, knowing the rest of the Bible, it is Judah. What's God doing? He's protecting his seed. And so these two boys were born of a Canaanite, which means they were already corrupt. But secondly, they were wicked. It says, evil in the sight of the Lord and displeasing in the sight of the Lord. So they sinned in a way that deserved death, because all sin deserves death. God just withholds his judgment because of his grace and waiting for people to come to repentance and understanding that Christ will come in this way. But when you're in the way of the seed, and they didn't know this, just like we don't know, if we're in the way of God's will, God's plan, and you are involved in some level of sin, you know what? God can take your life. Absolutely. Just like he did here. You know, he did this as well at another time in Acts chapter 5. There was a husband and wife named Ananias and Sapphira, and they lied about what they gave to the church. They sold property. They gave some of it to the church. Let's say they gave about half of it to the church. But they told the church that they gave most all of it. They just wanted to keep some proceeds for themselves, but they wanted the honor of saying, hey, look how much I've given to the Lord. Well, right away, Peter said, why did you lie to the Holy Spirit? Now the Lord's taken your life. And boom, just like that, God dropped both of them dead. Now, I suspect that there's many people who have lied about what they've given to the church throughout history. They didn't drop dead. Why those two? Because they stood in the way of God's plan for the church as the church was barely starting to get going and move, and this created the necessary fear of the Lord to protect all the giving that had taken place. Why did these two boys die here in Genesis? Because they were Canaanite blood mixing with the seed, causing corruption. If the seed would have been through them, so God killed them. Because it was out of rebellion that they came, and they have their own sin as well. So we see that God took these two boys out. They were men now, took them out because of their own sin, but they also stood in the way of the seed. And they had wickedness in them, because those are the words, evil in the sight of the Lord, displeasing in the sight of the Lord. So they died. And then verse 11 comes along. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up, for he thought, I'm afraid that he too may die like his brothers. So Tamar went and lived in her father's house. So Judah saw these two, and the wife needs to have some level of way to keep the inheritance. And so he said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, this was Er's first wife. We don't know if she was a Canaanite or not. We just know she was called Tamar. And he just told her, remain a widow and live with me until my son Shelah grows up, then I'll give him to you. I think Judah thought that somehow it must have been her. Tamar was cursed or some way, because his boys are dying, and he didn't want Shelah to die. So he said, wait for him to grow up. So Tamar went and lived in her father's house. Now, after a considerable time, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. So this is the Canaanite woman, and she died. And when the time of mourning was ended, Judah went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. It was told to Tamar, behold, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. So she removed her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil and wrapped herself and sat in the gateway of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah had grown up and she had not been given to him as a wife. So she's waiting and she's watching about when she's going to be able to get this last son to be her husband, because she knew that she was waiting for him to give Shelah to her. And he's hemming and hawing, and he's not wanting to do this because he sees that his boys are all dying, and they're all completely dying. And so he's just delaying wherever he can. And so he went up to a place called Timnah to shear sheep. Now it's interesting, names and locations of places are important. And Timnah is actually the same place where a man that you know named Samson had gone. And and Samson went, in Judges chapter 14, he went to go seek a wife there from the Philistines. So they were in this Canaanite Philistine territory, which is enemy territory a lot, but he's over there, he's separated from his brothers, he's out in the wilderness having no discernment whatsoever. So he leaves, he goes to the deeper land of Canaan, the land of Timnah. He marries a Canaanite, has children, they die. He's just off on his own, no discernment whatsoever. So, what we saw in verse 13, he says, it was told to Tamar, behold, your father is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. So she removed her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil and wrapped herself, and sat in the gateway of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that Sheila had grown up and she had not been given to him as a wife. So she knew that Judah was withholding giving one of his sons to her as a husband so she could have an inheritance, her children, and she would have inheritance. So she knew he was not acting upright. So when Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot, for she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, here now, let me come in to you. For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, what will you give me that you may come in to me? He said, therefore, I'll give you a young goat from the flock. She said, moreover, will you give a pledge until you send it? He said, what pledge shall I give you? And he said, your seal and your cord, and your staff that is in your hand. So he gave them to her, and went into her, and she conceived by him. And she rose and departed, and removed her veil, and put on her widow's garments. So her plan was to say, you know what, you won't give me your sons, then I will get a child by you. And so she went out and intercepted him on the road as he was going to shear sheep. And she was at some area to be like what would be called a cult prostitute or a temple prostitute. So it made sense that there would be a prostitute there because there was a Canaanite temple nearby. And that's how they all kind of combined their worship with fertility and all that kind of stuff. And so he saw her, he saw this attractive girl by the road dressed like a harlot. And so he said, let me spend some time. And so he did that, and she covered herself, meaning not with her clothes, but she made sure she had insurance. Because she said, what will you give me that you may come in? What's your offering? He said, I'll give you a young goat. He said, but you don't have a young goat now. What do you give me? So she took his signet ring and his cord and his staff, things that could identify Judah. And she took that. Basically, in today's world, she would say, give me your ID. Give me your ID. And so he went into her, and she conceived. She got pregnant. So then she arose and departed, removed her veil, and put on her widow's garments. So she immediately changed all her clothing and put on long-sleeved things that looked like a widow, mourning. And when Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite to receive the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. He asked the men of the place, saying, where's the temple prostitute who is here by the road at Enaim? But they said, there's been no temple prostitute here. So he returned to Judah and said, I did not find her. Furthermore, the men of that place said, there's been no temple prostitute here. I mean, nobody knew, because she was carefully positioned to just intercept Judah and go off with him. She wasn't there day in and day out and obvious to the men who were around. She didn't spend any time with anybody else. She targeted Judah. So the people were saying, we have no idea what you're talking about. So verse 23, Judah said, let them keep him. Otherwise it'll become a laughingstock. After all, I sent this young goat. We did not find her. So I'm going to look like a fool walking around to try to give a goat to somebody who's not here. Now it was about 3 months later that Judah was informed, your daughter-in-law, Tamar, has played the harlot, and behold, she is also with child by harlotry. They could see she's pregnant. Basically, people around said, Judah, your daughter-in-law is pregnant. How'd that happen? She's obviously been fooling around. Well, bring her out and let her be burned. That's pretty harsh. An embarrassment to Judah. The man with no discernment whatsoever, no spiritual discernment at all, leaves his brothers, goes to the deeper into the land of Canaan, marries a Canaanite woman, has sons. God kills them because God is protecting his seed. Seed's with Judah. God is protecting his seed. And so the boys are wicked. They're corrupt. And then in their attitude, their sinning, God takes them out. But Tamar, we don't know about her, but we know that she was the first wife of Ur. Well, she was the wife of Ur, not the first wife. She was the wife of Ur. And so Judah was protecting Shelah. He didn't want Shelah to die. Now, Shelah was born of a Canaanite as well. But as long as he's staying away from anything to do with the seed, God didn't kill him. But when Tamar went out and intercepted Judah, she got pregnant by him. Remember, Judah's carrying the seed. So now Tamar gets pregnant by him. But when he finds out, he says, let her be burned. I mean, again, without even asking any questions at all. So verse 25, it was while she was being brought out that she sent to her father-in-law, saying, I'm with child by the man to whom these things belong. And she said, please examine and see whose signet ring and cord and staff are these. So in essence, she pulled out the ID. Said, here, who is this? Whose picture is this? Judah recognized them and said, she's more righteous than I, and inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah, he did not have relations with her again. So he backed away and understood he was in complete shame. And he was in shame because he has no spiritual discernment at all to follow the laws of the Lord, to follow what the Lord is saying. He's just going off on his own. But God was preserving him because he's a child of the promise. It came about at the time that she was giving birth, that behold, there were twins in her womb. Moreover, it took place while she was giving birth. One put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread in his hand, saying, this one came out first. So that would be the older. The older right here is the first one that came out. Stuck his hand out. She put a scarlet thread around it. But it came about as he drew back his hand that behold, his brother came out. Then she said, what a breach you made for yourself. So he named him Perez. Afterward, his brother came out with the scarlet thread in his hand, and he was named Zerah. So Zerah had his hand out, but he didn't come out because his brother jumped over on top of him, pulled him by the shoulder and pulled him down, and he came out first. So really the older, in this case of the twins, the older was Zerah, but the younger was Perez. And so she had these twins. Well, that's an important thing, because one thing we understand when we take a look and go in the book of Ruth, what we see at the very end, when Naomi was holding the child that Ruth had born from Boaz, they named him Obed. Now these are the generations, verse 18, these are the generations of Perez. Verse 18 of Ruth chapter 4. To Perez was born Hezron, Hezron born Ram, Ram Amminadab, Amminadab Nahshon Salmon, and to Salmon was born Boaz, and Boaz Obed, Obed to Jesse, and Jesse to David. So we see the line of the seed going right there from Perez, the younger, who was born to Tamar. The younger who was born to Tamar. And again, I'll show you one more in the genealogy in Matthew chapter 1. What we see here is the genealogy of Jesus. The record of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Notice, Judah and his brothers. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. There we have, right there in the list of the genealogy of Jesus, Tamar coming in. Perez was the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram. Ram was the father of Abinadab, Abinadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon. Salmon was the father of Boaz by Rahab. Boaz was the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse. Jesse was the father of David the king. So Tamar wasn't a wife of Judah, but she bore the children of Judah, Perez and Tamar. And Perez takes us right to the line of David, to the line of Christ. And so that's God preserving his seed through as he's maneuvering around, making sure that his promise is going to happen. God will make sure that his promise always happens, no matter what. even when we have weakened faith like Abraham, when we try to arrange things so it works, like I make God's will happen in my life and I'm making it be different than what God's will is, it's going to happen the way God had it. And even when I have my own sins and deception that take place, like Jacob, God's promise is still going forth. And even when Joseph is now being thrown into an Egyptian prison by his brothers, even when the brothers are in massive sin, and specifically Judah here, who's carrying the seed. Joseph's not carrying the seed. Judah is. Joseph is going ahead into Egypt, and we're going to see why. Because he's there to protect his family. God is working always in advance to protect his people of his promise. And that's happening in the background. But meanwhile, Judah is showing no spiritual discernment whatsoever. No ability to understand God's will. No ability to understand even what holiness is. Anything. God is working around him, even causing the deaths of his children to bring his will about, to preserve the seed, to make sure his promise will happen. Judah learned a lesson about how he got humiliated through this, and he understood, I need to get back with my family, which he did, because he was with his brothers when they went to Egypt. But he left just because he's wandering on his own. God graciously brings him back into the fold with his brothers to learn even more when they go to Egypt. This is what we see. God moving continually in the background and the foreground, even when there's a complete lack of spiritual discernment. God is not frustrated by any of that. And so God's promise is unfolding. That's what Genesis is all about. It's about God. It's not about these men. It's about God, whose promise is continuing to unfold as his goodness is shown in his promise to the world. So we'll see you next as we hit to Genesis chapter 39.